Wow, this is a nice new item this dropped for me.
Hand it over. Hand it over to the loot council. I need that. We gotta auction it off to the highest bidder in our guild, Dratnos. You're not allowed to keep that item. That even though it dropped for you, it's part of the loot council. You know the rules. I'm sorry. Hand it over.
So this week's topic is going to be Master Loot, which has had a bit of a philosophy change coming from Ion, who in his interview with Asmongold basically signaled there's been some subtle hints that they've been moving in this direction, but he signaled that there is more intent on their end to move back towards Master Loot in some way, to some extent. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in 10.0, but down the line somewhere, moving loot a bit back towards the older system.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest things is that the loot systems have been starting to get discussed between Ian and the community. And for one, people really, really want Master Looter back. And dude, it's one of those things that like the current iteration of loot that we have, where it's like this semi-tradable personal loot thing where people have to hand their loot away to their GM or whatever after they get it, and only sometimes is it tradable, has felt pretty bad for a while. And we've entered this iteration of the game where you're also getting tier gear and stuff like that too, and just this weird tradable level of personal loot has felt awful, especially with the tier set stuff.
Yeah, I felt like especially the decision to make it so that if I had normal tier, I couldn't trade heroic tier was like a particularly grating one on my soul. Like it felt so bad to be ineligible to trade loot that was like plus 50 DPS for me and plus 500 for somebody else. And so I'm glad that they're looking at this, because it's definitely true that, they came out with personal loot, and over time they've sort of stapled things on, duct taped more restrictions and rules on how it works, and like opened up some more things you can trade. And they keep trying to do this, but now we're at this point where if you look at it, it's kind of unwieldy, and it's actually pretty hard, especially for players that aren't like super in touch with all of how it works, to even intuitively know whether or not they will be eligible to trade a certain item if it drops for them, right? Think about like, okay, does this need to be the right weapon type? Does this trinket need to be for my loot spec? Like all of these different questions. Do I need to have equipped a ring in both of my ring slots? All of these things that like, is anybody really certain about the answer to those questions until they actually see whether it's got the blue text on it or not, the new item that's dropped for them?
I do think that one of the biggest issues with the current loot system is what Ian hits on right here whenever he was talking to Asmongold. And he was talking about, so whenever you're like the only hunter in your raid, and you could have like if you had a bow drop in the Master Looter thing without any hunters in your raid, that would be a problem. But if like whenever we swap to the personal loot system, if you're like the only hunter in the raid, it also takes a long time to be able to get that bow. Whereas at the same time, if you have this group with 6 warriors, you're only going to get warrior loot, and it's completely tradable with no restrictions. Is that like really the way that it's supposed to go either, if you do already have access to like those item levels and some of those things? And so it's been a weird situation where they didn't want, at least how Ian made it sound, they didn't want multiple experiences of like different loot systems and how they functioned. So they did condense it down to one loot system, but I have not been a fan of the one that we've had for a little while now.
Yeah, the fact that it sort of balances out, and like if you have 5 gun users in a group versus 1, you still get like the same amount of guns per gun user over time, is a big upside compared to old Master Looter. Old Master Looter, it used to be mail armor. A lot of raid groups would have like 2 mail wearers, 10 leather wearers, and just like the mail wearers would get kitted and the leather wearers would be scrap fighting each other for one piece of loot every couple of weeks. But then Blizzard's geniusly introducing a new mail wearing class, because all along that's been part of the plan. They've known Master Looters coming back, so they've created another mail wearer to better balance the armor types.
So how do you feel about like Master Looter in general? Because I'm not necessarily even a fan of like this being the way that gear goes in World of Warcraft, just like this Master Looter phenomenon. What do you think about it?
Yeah, like I think there are upsides to Master Looter, especially for organized groups that are full of players that are team oriented. And that all just want to, optimize for the good of the guild. And you don't want this awful feeling of like getting an item that would be better for somebody else and not being able to trade it. But I've always thought that one of the nice things that kind of personal loot protects people from is if you're in a guild that's like pretty hardcore, but you still want the items for yourself, right? You still want to do M plus, you still want upgrades for yourself. And like, even though an item might be slightly better for somebody else, like it feels bad to trade it away for a lot of people. Now, I'm not in a guild like that. I think most people in my guild would rather have Master Looter. I personally would always rather trade, 90 DPS for somebody else instead of 70 DPS for me. But a lot of people are kind of protected right now from having to do that because of the personal loot system. So I think it'll be interesting to see how they re-implement this and whether they want to continue to protect those players. And that's not even getting into like the horror cases that are cited by the like big fans of personal loot, which is, ninjas, GMs that take all the loot, all of these sorts of cases, GMs that have preferential treatment. There are a lot of dumb people out there, people that think a lot of wrong things about like which items are good for which classes. And when you start having those people deciding which items go where, things can start to either feel tyrannical or just stupid and annoying. And those guilds exist and may start to run rampant with that once they're allowed to again.
I think for me, it's like with Master Looter and like the current iteration of personal loot, the reason that I'm not like a super hot on Master Looter is because I feel like the amount of loot that we've been getting lately is just like super low. And then you only start to run into issues of this whenever you look at like how it affects M plus and PvP specifically, because all three aspects of the game are tied in pretty heavily with how the loot system ends up functioning. And like for Mythic plus and PvP, I don't see a world where you like have those as Master Looter. That's like always going to be like a personal loot phenomenon. And so the amount of loot that's going to have to drop from those is going to have to continue to be relatively low. And we're in a situation where we're those players, because like Mythic Plus, there are a lot of players who were in like WoD or Mr. Pandaria and stuff like that whenever like before Mythic Plus existed, where they all like most people raided at that point, right? And they kind of dabbled in PvP as well. And they kind of interacted with the game in a lot of different areas. Whereas now there are a lot of players who either only PvP or only Mythic Plus or only raid, and they only interact with the game in like this one form or fashion. And I think that like the shift to ML like could be a problem where it's like the amount of loot that you're going to be getting from Mythic Plus and stuff like that is still going to be just a major problem overall.
There's sort of a converse problem to this as well, which is there's a type of guild that has like 5 people that do all the M plus outside of raid, gear their characters fully, and then like 15 people that raid log, right? And in an ML world, right, you just would always give the gear to, if somebody's got a 272 and somebody else has got a 258 or whatever, 259, you just give the item to the person who has the 259, right? And so you actually kind of get punished for running keys in a guild like that, right? In a situation like that. Yeah, where I think this is a real tension that does exist in a lot of guilds where it's like people feel like that will feel like they'll get punished for gearing their character more because then they'll be the less correct person to assign the raid loot to. So yeah, I'm interested in how they solve these problems or whether they choose to solve them. I'm certainly interested in loot getting overhauled to some extent. So I'm glad that they're looking at this, and I'm glad that they have intention to change the philosophy somehow.
So let's talk about deterministic loot. I think that, at least for me personally, no matter what they do, they need like some form of being able to get like a deterministic piece, especially over time. I think that currencies are like really lame, though. It's hard.
Once you clear the raid like 4 times, or do 4 weeks of farm or whatever, something like that, I feel like you should be able to buy any one specific item off of that, right? You shouldn't need to kill Kel'Thuzad infinite or 20 times or whatever RNG decides to get a Jathus. It's like if you decide that Jathus is your most important item, if you decide Edgenite's your most important item, if you have something that you really want, you should be able to get that yourself from clearing a bunch. I think they could tie this into professions, especially with the new work order system. Ooh. If you just got BOP mats from killing bosses, and then you could put up a work order for like a mythic boss loot. Once you've done that 4 times, like once you've killed it on that difficulty 4 times, right? And then you also need a crafter that's like Giga Abyss crafter and has like a bunch of the awesome crafting stuff and a bunch of the rare mats from all the other whatever parts of the game. And so it costs you a lot of gold, or having an experienced crafter that's your friend or something like that to get this crafted for you. But then like you could get your super important item and also make professions more relevant again as well, but in a way that's not like everybody needs to have this. It's like everybody needs to know a blacksmith or pay one on the server. Sure. So that's what I would do with it.
I mean, personally, I think that I would actually go even further into personal loot. Like if I was designing a loot system, I would make like untradeable personal loot be the new norm. Increase the amount of drops by just a ton. Like the amount of drops that we're getting right now is part of the problem. But in addition to that, then add some level of deterministic loot drops. Mine would probably be through the Great Vault. So they've talked about in interviews a couple of times the fact that they want to keep the Great Vault around, and I think the Great Vault could be an excellent source of like deterministic loot. It doesn't have to be like this random RNG chance stuff, and I think that there are certain ways that it doesn't have to be through a currency. I do think that currencies are kind of lame, but I do think that like they could add a currency or something else to allow you to be able to get that more deterministic way. Maybe it'd be through crafting professions or something like that. Do you prefer this ML way, or do you think that it's because it's like a bit outdated? Like there are basically very few MMOs run like ML anymore. Most of them are either like completely tradable PL or like some form of like being able to buy gear off auction houses, or like it's completely untradeable personally. Very few games have ML anymore.
I think I would have more fun with just like full old Master Looter back. I think that would be better for me, but I've always thought that the personal loot system was probably a better compromise. So, but I hope they can come up with an even better compromise that helps us all win a little bit more, because there certainly are some flaws in the current system.
And that's one of the biggest things is like, it's not necessarily that they're talking about bringing back Master Loot. It's the fact that they're willing to listen to the community on the potential for bringing back Master Looter, and looking at all of the problems or potential upside that a bunch of different loot options have. Because I think it would be really easy for them to just like sit with what we currently have, kind of iterate on it a little bit more, iterate on the vault just a hair more, iterate on maybe professions a little bit, and then just kind of leave the loot the way it is. But I think that there are a lot of players who have been having a lot of issues, specifically the players who only do like one form of content, whether it be Mythic Plus or PvP or Raid. Those players I feel like are getting kind of the short end of the stick a lot of the time with some of the loot decisions that have been made, and like how the game is so interconnected. It's kind of weird because the game is so interconnected, and honestly kind of because of the introduction of Mythic Plus, Blizzard had to do a lot of weird stuff with their loot system, to where those Mythic Plus players weren't either just like gigabytes and completely outscaling raiders, but at the same time had their own way of like getting gear, and it's caused a lot of problems on all ends, I think, of the loot spectrum.
Yeah, I think that it is agreed. Just the coolest thing is that they are looking at these and that they have many of the correct problems identified, although the specific solution, again, they don't know exactly what it's going to be yet, and it's unclear when it will be. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments, whatever you'd like to see happen with loot, whether you like Master Loot or whether you like personal loot, whether you've been swayed or whether you've always felt this way. Because I've certainly evolved a lot on loot over the past couple of years, thinking on it.
Dude, I used to be perma Master Looter needs to come back, like this is trash, but I've been swayed over time.
Yeah.
All right. That's going to be it for us today. We hope to see you guys in the next video, and we wish you all a great day. Goodbye.